Good morning, everybody, or good evening, wherever you are. I'm coming to you from Montana, from Bozeman, Montana, in the Gallatin River watershed, which makes up part of the Yellowstone River watershed here, or the Missouri River watershed. And my partner and I, Melissa Troutman, made Invisible Hand as a part of our investigative work that we do at Public Herald. We run a nonprofit news agency called Public Herald, and 100% of our reporting is centered around investigations into water. So that leads us directly into the story that you watched today, which is about people who are trying to protect their water resources by using something like rights of nature, which is, to us, is one of the most revolutionary and important environmental movements that are happening, worldwide. I got into rights of nature really early on, like back when I was in college, back in 2008, and gave talks about it. And back then you might as well have been talking about aliens. I mean, there's professors, and nobody thought that was even close to realistic. To even have a discussion about it was really hard. But in the course of making this film, this film was a roughly 6-year project. We saw rights of nature go from something that we could barely mention in an article, without having a lot of issues, to being able to publish entire articles about it and have tons of different communities worldwide who were doing things about it, and developing dialogue, developing narrative. And then all of a sudden, when we released the film in 2020, we saw just a major international interest. So the first year this film was out, it was viewed in 154 countries. So you can see the response to rights of nature has just gone like wildfire, and it's totally global, and there's just a lot happening. So I think that this is awesome. What you guys are doing here. The peat lands in the United States are not well registered or protected or talked about, period. And our first film, Triple Divide, which we did at Public Herald, is actually on top of an unregistered peatland area. So yeah, I'm very interested to learn more from you, actually, about how it could influence our reporting, and things that we could do. So awesome to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Hi, Joshua. Yeah, thank you again for coming. I was wondering if you could speak more on your process, you and Melissa's process on choosing this story to tell and your relationship to this story.
So like I said, it wasn't a story that existed anywhere for us to hold on to. So we're going back to 2013, right? We released our first documentary on fracking. We're screening it everywhere. People at the screenings are saying, what are we supposed to do about fracking? And we're like, well, here's these traditional options. You can deal with zoning, and you can deal with, I don't know, trying to pass a ban with zoning or something. And, they're pretty lame. They're not realistic at all. So we were like, or you could maybe pass a charter that included personhood to nature, and ban fracking that way. And we would then talk about the last person who's in that film. Oddly enough, Triple Divide is the stepping stone to Invisible Hand. So at the end of Triple Divide, there's a goat farmer, and he says, I'm going to protect this property, and I'm going to protect my goats no matter what. And I'm already doing it. And then what he did was he passed an easement that included, rights of nature for that property there. So it was a segue for us to go, into this if we could. So we were looking for the story, and all of a sudden, Grant Township, this small town in the middle of Pennsylvania, in one of the most conservative places of Pennsylvania, decided to take on rights of nature and pass this bill, and take on state government and take on the oil and gas industry. So you had this tiny group of people taking on one of the largest industries in the country, with one of the, biggest backings from both political parties for fracking, and doing it through rights of nature. So that's what got us into this. So our naive idea was, sweet, well, we'll go talk to, the we were touring Triple Divide nationally. So like we'll stop in, you know, Wisconsin, and we'll talk to the Ho Chunk people about rights of nature, and we'll go here and we'll talk about rights of nature. But this is something, that's still a Western reaction to what we've done, right? This is our way of dealing with what capitalism has done, what our exploitations of the environment has done, and it's still, predominantly our language. And it wasn't adopted into their cultures as this Western, term paradigm, even though, of course, their culture, their language, as you see in the film, holds nature sacred in a way that you would want to do so through rights of nature, right? The way they speak about it, the way they treat it, the way they govern the land are all perfect, rights of nature examples, but they don't particularly call it that. So that was really difficult for us with the film, because we didn't want, such like a, I guess, a white film, that's what based on this like really important subject. So luckily, through those 6 years, this started to take off, and we could bring in more communities, like the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, right? Like that happened in 2019, 2018. So that was the story, like, oh, sweet, we can bring that in, and try and make that thread. And then at the very end, we were like, how are we supposed to, bring this indigenous wisdom into the film? And then, Melissa had the great idea, well, let's record, the prophecy and see if we can thread that into the editing. And we did. So we recorded the prophecy with Dega Wanondas on the Ohio, which is the Allegheny River, which you see being fought for in the film with the Seneca Nation. And then we brought those two together. And that was a super important fight, because you had, with the Ohio fight, because you had, these two nations building an alliance, this very like white rural area of America building an alliance with the Seneca Nation, and defeating this fracking industry, which would have been right next to the peat land that I talked about that was unregistered in Triple Divide. So yeah, how do we choose it? We choose things very organically. If they tie into what our larger investigations have been doing around water, then we do everything we can to bring their story into our coverage, so long as it's like an exclusive, right? I mean, we do focus a lot on exclusive. So yeah, I don't know, it's a long explanation. That's what we did.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Frankie, I was wondering maybe if you want to ask your question then about the kind of language and communities.
Sure. First of all, thank you for the film. I think it it took a lot of I like what you said about the different threads. I feel like there was a lot of threads, and I think that was something that was quite nice, that there was this like main story, but then it also brought in this other kind of things that were happening at the same time. And one thing I was, because like, even so, I don't really know that much about law, or like the language sometimes gets me. And that was also something that I felt when watching the film, that some of the film was then mimicking the language of the law. So it was like taking you through then the jurisdiction, kind of trying to explain it. And I would get lost. And sometimes that made it hard for me to then get back into the story. And I feel like probably that's an experience that like a lot of people have, especially people that maybe come from communities that, you know, with low education levels or whatever it is. And I was wondering if like that was something that you saw in communities, whether like that kind of complexity of the legal system and the language would put people off, or would, yeah, I don't know, make people less engaged.
I think that, yeah, disengagement regarding the details of everything is always a major thing, right? So if you want to be really disengaged, then you read our investigative reporting, because that's where it's like the details and the language is like ridiculous, right? You know, like thousands and thousands of words to try and make sure that we're building an evidence-based story that can be used inside of a courtroom as evidence in regards to neglect on the environment. So those stories are places where the heaviest parts of what you're talking about are embedded. So the film is actually a place where we're trying to strip away many of those parts. But with this, unfortunately, we had to be specific about certain things regarding zoning and ordinance, you know, passing bans with home rule, those kinds of things, because the NGOs in the United States are not really backing this kind of work. So if you're a community and you're dealing with a problem, you're mostly hearing from an NGO who's telling you that you need to take measures to do zoning and ordinance laws, right? You need to like redesign your zoning, redesign your ordinances, and protect your environment that way. And that's super risky, because what it's doing is it's setting a community up to spend like 5 years of wasting their energy resources to do something within a system that you just saw can't protect anything, right? They're going to sue the community for trying to protect somebody. So we're trying to break down, you know, that wall that they're creating to protect the environment and take people straight into this whole other world. So there are like some like legal terms and ideas and things that we're sticking in there that are not as interesting, but we're trying to hook in a lot of these people who are in these fights in the NGOs and say, and wake them up and say, hey, you know, you just heard your buzzword, and this is something that you could connect to your fight and go a lot further than what these NGOs are trying to do, right? So we're trying to break down that wall and move people into a new space. And I think we're seeing that, right? We're seeing like people who've seen the film, who've been inspired, and who are taking direct action now to try and get rights of nature included into their community's Bill of Rights, or to bans that they have against the industry. Like I just got an email from somebody in the Huron River over in Michigan who, you know, basically did what I just talked about and wants to, you know, override all that other traditional stuff that NGOs provide and go directly into rights of nature. So we're just trying to like help that bridge to happen. But I know what you're saying. It's easy to get lost in like the heaviness of these details, but we tried to lighten it up as much as we could for the film, and also thread in these huge ideas that we felt were super important.
No, I think it was important that you also did get a bit of that language in there. So yeah, thank you for answering.
Just before I pass to you, Natasha, actually, I just wanted to ask a follow-up on that. Have you heard from any of the NGOs, or have they given some kind of explanation why they are less, I don't know, drawn to the concept and trying to urge people in the other direction?
I mean, it's, man, it's, I mean, I have my opinions on it. I think that they've been mostly just staying out of the discussion. You know, there are signs of them now starting to bring more support to the idea. And to be honest, I think those signs came from the fact that Mark Ruffalo decided to make this important and back this and say this is an essential thing to do, which quote unquote made it cooler to be a part of. And then when DiCaprio also said this is super important, exactly, Hulk Protect, that's totally right. So when DiCaprio said, you know, we need to be paying attention to this, and what they're doing in South America with rights in nature is really important. And I'm backing that. When he said that, that also was the door to the NGOs to get them to transition into accepting this and making it part of their platform. So those two things were major. And then when the case with Los Cedros in Ecuador, when they won that case, you know, and all of a sudden you've got 25,000 acres plus protected as a result of a rights of nature ruling, that then validated many of the arguments the NGOs are making against rights of nature, which is that it doesn't have standing, doesn't have any real application, has no real success, blah, 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 right? So with that like concrete thing that happened, that's making a lot of ripples and a lot of changes in those spaces, and there's a lot more discussion happening. However, these are institutions in many instances which have a foundation based on traditional environmentalism. And traditional environmentalism deals with environmental law, and environmental law is an anthropocentric structure, right? It's not an ecocentric structure like rights of nature. You know, humans are at the center of that decision-making. So their nonprofits are very much, in many cases, built around that. And they have to break out of that and introduce an entirely new paradigm and get funders to back that. And the funders here, I mean, let's just put it this way. With our reputation at Public Herald and what we've done, and with our legacy in writing and producing films and doing all this, we put forth a funding proposal to roughly 20 or so foundations about bringing rights of nature into colleges. We partnered with a college to start a rights of nature college course to get this thing moving into the colleges, right? And we couldn't get a single one of them to back that program, even with colleges signing off on it. So that just shows me, you know, how little interest there is right now from funders and how much motivation against it there is from funders. So we're still super rogue, you know, dealing with this. And I'm sure NGOs who want to deal with it are probably facing the same thing that we just did, which was like, we're not going to give you any financial support to do this. So good luck, you know, good luck beating our traditional environmental system that we're giving millions of dollars to make sure that all the organizing is happening that way. You know, good luck getting rights of nature. But it doesn't even matter because so many people want rights of nature that, like, the money thing's like a total non-issue. Like it's such an organic growth and development, you know. I mean, I don't see that there's any way stopping it, right? I mean, that's why the film's called Invisible Hand, because I believe that rights of nature is this, you know, natural antithesis to the free market. And the fact that like economics is being taught without including rights of nature as the new economy, to me, is like anti-intellectual. You know, you have an entire world that doesn't operate like a free market anymore because nature's now calling the decisions in certain places where resources have been stripped away and they don't have the same kind of luxury to use all the water to make profit, right? Now nature's controlling those decisions, and that's not a free market. That's not capitalism. That's whatever is going to be a rights of nature economy, where nature governs those decisions. So it's coming one way or another, in my opinion. It would just be really cool if we didn't all have to be like doing it with like the most minimal things possible at our whatever, at our expense.
Yeah, I suppose it's also then important that it is being shaped first and foremost from the grassroots and from communities before the NGOs get involved as well. I suppose that it follows the pattern that's how you see the real change happening anyway. And then getting on board once there's kind of been those ripples already. Natasha has a question.
I just don't want to I don't want to name them, but it's not hard to figure out once you start digging into it. Yeah.
Fair. Natasha, go ahead.
Hi. Sorry, just want to show my face here. Thank you very much. I just finished watching it. I was really inspired. I was both terrified and horrified and inspired, and there was so much of it going on, so many emotions. I think just a comment then about what you just said there, just about the whole rights of nature thing. So I live in Ireland, and I think if people don't have a relationship with the land, even people who work the land, like the farmers, they don't read the land anymore. Like one of the kind of schemes that we're trying to introduce here, getting farmers to read the land, to understand where the soil, to kind of have that relationship that they no longer have because they're sort of told what to do at various periods. So some of them anyway have lost that relationship. And I think that the rights of nature seems so obvious to people who have relationship with nature, whereas it's less obvious to people who've kind of disconnected. My question, coming back to my question, is I think the sub-theme there seems to be is people's relationship with power and the relationship with their own power, I suppose, communities feeling empowered. And one thing that happens that people still have here is this idea that the authorities know best, that the institutions have our best interests at heart. And it's a sort of shock when they realize that maybe that isn't the case. That the people that have been advising you for so long actually don't have your interests or the environment. That the water's being polluted with nitrates here and so on. So I guess the question is maybe like how do you? People are also very lethargic about politics. So how do you kind of re-engage or for it to come from the community, as Bethany was just saying, that they need to have a sense of their own power or that relationship with the feeling that they actually can make a change or a difference. Sorry, I hope it's not too convoluted, my question.
No, your question makes total sense. That's not convoluted. I think that the reporting that we do at Public Herald is all about stripping away that propaganda about power in regards to who do you trust and what are they doing, right? So the ideas are that there's a environmental protection agency at the state level, and there's an environmental protection agency at the federal level, and there's also these experts associated with it, and they're protecting the environment doing XYZ. And our reporting has shown that is absolutely false, and that not only are they not protecting the environment, but they're acting in criminal ways against protecting it. So they're acting in criminal ways against the community and committing misconduct while they're supposed to be doing their job. So the way that we tell that story to a community is through water, because that's the one thing that connects all of us, right? Like if there's a water contamination issue I'm sure in Ireland or in the United States, and you have two political parties, everybody can usually agree that the water has to be clean. There's not usually a divide between the two political parties about whether or not the water should be clean for everybody to drink and for the environment to have access to. So that's where we try and find common ground, and where we try and start the conversation is, what are the threats to your water, and how is your water being protected? And is it at risk? Is it vulnerable to these threats? So that's usually how the conversation happens. And then it just kind of grows from there. And then you can see in the film with the community in Grant Township, you can see Judy, who of course thought, well, we have the EPA, they're going to do this, and we have the DEP, and they're going to do that, right? And she's like, holy shit, they're not doing any of that. Like, we have to do something entirely different if we want to handle this. So my advice, of course, is like, find those people who are willing to be the leaders and do something different and take charge and drive that message into the community. Because Grant Township, was successful because you had a handful of people distribute that message to the entire community. If you went to a college and you said, here's a situation in this particular place, and what they call, they jokingly call Alabama in the middle of Pennsylvania. Do you think that we could introduce this idea of rights of nature to protect the water in quote unquote Alabama? And I think most colleges would say absolutely not. Like, this isn't going to work, right? But it did work because you had these grassroots people who were leaders at the local level, and they took that and they shared it with their community in a digestible way, and they dealt with a threat that was coming there. And what was the threat that was coming there? It was radioactive waste from fracking, and they needed to prevent that from coming to their area. So how do we stop that? Well, we do that by passing rights of nature and giving ourselves control against the state and against the federal government, and letting nature speak for itself in the community. So it's really about finding that common ground. Like, what is the threat that's coming to the environment that sparks people's interest? How do you find a common ground there? And then, of course, on the brighter side of that, which is about soil biodiversity that you talked about, you could always bring about, like, what's the positive, the positive results for farmers and for anybody if we do protect the soil, if we do protect biodiversity in the soil, and we make sure that this, let's just say old growth soil, is protected and has its say. And what would that mean for the farmers? And the way that I used to run a nonprofit for sustainable agriculture, and I was trying to overthrow the local food economy, and we did all kinds of crazy shit, and it was awesome. But one thing that we did was we said, listen, if we invest in our soil and we invest in our watershed, we can create, in our economy, we can create our own certification, and we can totally trump the organic certification, and we can trump any other certification, and we can control our market premium, our market price, based on the identity that we create for our soil and for our water. So that's what we did. Like, for 4 years, we just created a brand that was a quote unquote certification for the area, and we distributed it amongst these 15 farms, and people bought into that. And they said, we want to support this certification, not other ones. And that united people on a around water, but in a totally different way, right? You're just getting their market interest ignited and trying to bring them into the fold by saying, hey, you could be doing better in this economy if we protected the soil, if we protected water, by creating a certification for ourselves that shows that we're doing that, and letting the community know that we're the ones to trust and that we're the ones to invest in. And that totally works. Like, that's worked every single time that's been attempted. It's the Achilles heel of the free market. Local certification is totally the Achilles heel. So, I don't know. I'm just always trying to think of like solutions I don't like getting blocked down by walls of whatever. But for me, like, you know, if Rights of Nature had its own certifications tied to local chapters to take control of their economy, I think that would be kick ass and would go a long way. So for sure.
Maybe we go to Oka's question, actually, who initially had asked about whether you conducted interviews with like the other side, so corporate representative, and then that you had reached out, but maybe you can speak a little bit about that. I don't know, that interaction, the challenges with doing that, like how that kind of played out.
Yeah, I think that's so. We definitely go directly to corporations and directly to their leaders and try to get them to answer things, because in our reporting, we just see that is the most valuable way to tell the story. I don't quote unquote balance stories, you know, like this story is not balanced because this person isn't in there. I'm like, well, they're not involved in our story, so they're not going to get their talk, you know, their talking points in there. You know, I'm not going to call the I don't know, Petroleum Institute and say, can you guys give us a comment? Right. But we do talk to the oil and gas companies directly tied to these cases, which is I think it was PG&E in the film. So PG&E and PG&E's attorneys were both reached out to give comment in the film and to talk, and they turned it down for years. I mean, we're talking like 3 years of turning down interviews and not talking. They also, there was a guy named Kevin. Oh shit, I can't remember his last name. Kevin somebody. He is the one who talks against rights of nature initiatives and usually talks against cell death in this corner of the United States. Kevin Mooney, I think is his last name, Mooney, and he's an attorney for the oil and gas companies. So he'll say, whatever, these guys are trying to create their own country. You know, you can't create your own country in the middle of the United States by passing rights of nature bills. These things are unconstitutional, blah, blah, blah. So we tried very hard. I tried very hard to get Kevin on camera to, you know, exercise his free will to debate us about this topic. And he was just, he was like, oh, maybe next month. And he's like, maybe in 6 months, maybe in 9 months. Like he just ran, you know, he totally ran from us. He wouldn't do it. So we definitely tried to talk to them. And so in the film, we just included the antagonists that we could find, right? Like, who were the antagonists that we could find on the internet or in certain places. And those antagonists are, for Grant Township, they were the state. So the state, you know, has whatever they want to say against it. And then we have the oil and gas company who wouldn't say anything, who I think we mentioned in the film. It's like, you know, we try to interview them, they won't say anything, blah, blah, blah. So we then talked to Lake Erie Bill of Rights, and they gave us their antagonists, which were the PR companies that ran advertising campaigns against them. So we included those PR companies' campaigns in the film. So you see the commercials that BP ran against Lake Erie Bill of Rights, where it was like, you know, the fish jumping out, like where we made that stuff up, and they're like, these outsiders are coming in and they're trying to do this, and you know, they're just invasive people and we need to get them out of here. Basically, it was like the threat of the ad campaigns. It was super bad, and it's like some PR company made a lot of money on a really bad idea. So we did include that, and then in the international fight, we included some talking heads, who were people who were like, you know, on RT News or wherever, and they were like, "This isn't, you know, insane. This is ludicrous. This is not moral. Totally not moral to say that humans should be on the same playing field as nature." Like, insane, right? Like, that's kind of their argument over there, which is hilarious. So we just included those things. But in Triple Divide, you do see we did sneak in, because nobody knew us back then. Like, we could sneak in and do stuff. So we snuck in a few things and interviewed people in the oil and gas industry in Triple Divide about their protections for water, and what they had to say. So there are definitely more industry reps in Triple Divide that we could get access to because we didn't know us. But after that, our names were out there. People knew we were tied to Ruffalo. It was like, it was a lot harder for us to sneak in and do the things we do. We walk into a room and we had cameras and people were like, who are they before? And they're like, okay, we know they're so-and-so now. Right. So it's harder for us to just get in front of people and talk to them. So yeah, what's my advice there? Hire unknown filmmakers and have them go ask the questions. I should have done that. That's what we should have done.
Do you have any advice?
maybe
Just a follow-up question to that. Do you have any advice maybe for activists or people that aren't really as well known yet to get in front of these like antagonists, as you call them, and have a conversation and kind of show like goodwill that you're actually trying to hear what they have to say and maybe not trying to get like a gotcha moment?
We're not polarized in the work that we do. Like, we're not saying, we're not listening to you or giving you a chance to talk. And so I guess I should so for Public Herald's reports, when we're dealing with oil and gas, a large majority of those stories are off the record sources who are pro gas, pro oil, don't have a position for rights of nature. And they're trying to protect their land or their property from the threats of the industry. So they confide in us to tell these stories about pollution. And, we then tell their story off the record in a larger story, which is essentially us working with people who would not normally speak to activists, right? Like, they would never talk to Earth First or Greenpeace if they walked in, in the room. So what's my advice? My advice is like, I think investigative journalism is super important, and journalism itself is super powerful. It does let you bring somebody into the room who can hear both sides and tell both stories. So, my first advice is if you're going to tell a story and you want to tell a story, especially as activists, hopefully you can do that through a journalism outlet that everybody can read and get access to, right? And that's one way to distribute that story, where people will read it from both sides and listen from both sides. I think that's critical. But if you want to confront them, talk to them, get them at the table. Turning the cameras on for direct actions is always really powerful, right? If you perform a direct action at an event and you lock down an event or you lock something down and you want to get people's responses that way, I think that's the best way to do it, right? Like, you can get reactions that way and you can get responses that way and you can get people on camera in the chaos of it, and probably get really important information out there. But outside of that, I really think for us, the best way that we've gotten people to talk from the other side is by introducing them to somebody they don't know who they're comfortable talking to, because they think it's a journalist that they're just going to randomly answer questions for. But really it's, investigative journalists who's done a ton of legwork already on them. I don't know where you find common ground, with these guys. You're dealing with an ideology that says, the profit is at the center of everything, man is at the center of everything. And how do you change their opinions on that? They're going to have to lose faith in their economic structure and that whole ideology. And that's just a whole bigger, identity crisis that hasn't happened yet. So I don't know. I really don't know like the answer, like how to answer it, but there are ways to get them on camera and to get them to talk, but getting them to like really listen, you know, I think probably Greta Thunberg's the best example of that just not happening, right? Like she's tried in tremendous ways to do that. And unfortunately, you know, they weren't willing to give somebody, you know, at her age time of day. They would just make fun of her, just sick, right? But that's how they are. That's who they are. So yeah, I don't know what else to say. That's that.
So I was actually wondering what ended up happening with the waste and the injection pipeline. So they said not in our town, but what happens next? This is something that you hear a lot also just in climate justice, where you have a community organizing and getting the power and being able to say, we don't want this industry in our town, or we don't want this fracking in our town, but then it just gets sent on to like less a town that's less able to mobilize. So yeah, I was wondering if you knew actually what happened afterwards.
Yeah, we do actually. So we've done an investigation on this, and this we feel is one of the most important things, because with oil and gas waste, all oil and gas waste worldwide, you're dealing with radioactivity. So you've got radioactivity in all oil and gas waste, and that means that it has a 1,600-year legacy. Right? It's insane how long it is. So it's all heavily saturated with radium. Radium has a half-life of 1,600 years, and it's gonna, you know, be soluble in water and move with water. You know, it's not like uranium and thorium. It's not gonna sit there or whatever. So the situation is that if it doesn't get pumped underground, if the waste doesn't get stored underground, it gets stored above ground or treated above ground. If it's treated above ground, our reports have proven and shown, and the state hid this for years. We had to get this out of them through right to know requests, that those facilities who are treating oil and gas waste, who say that they're cleaning the radium out and it's no longer radioactive, are total bullshit. The results from the studies that the state had, where they didn't identify the industry, show that they weren't able to remove like 90% of the radium. So 90% of the radium is still in the wastewater that they're discharging back to American rivers, back to American waterways. So it's just pumping radioactivity into American waterways, happening every day, happening right now. And those treatment facilities are getting waste that's around, let's just say 10,000 picocuries per liter in that study for radium. The safe drinking water limit for radium is 5 picocuries per liter, and they're getting 10,000 picocuries per liter inside of the oil and gas waste. All right. So they're only able to remove the radium down to like 9,000 or 8,000. So 8,000 picocuries per liter of radium, limits 5, getting discharged to American waterways. So the Clean Water Act in America, however that's taught in school over there or whatever, is total bullshit. Doesn't cover radioactivity or any of these other substances. So we just released a report at Public Herald this week showing a map of these permits that allow for this stuff to happen. And they've never even mapped these permits, right? So if you have a question about discharges to waterways, what's the cumulative impact of discharges and how many NPDES permits are out there and where are they? No one could have answered that question since 1980 because nobody maps NPDES permits. They're called NPDES permits. So we just mapped it for the first time in Pennsylvania. And you can see like how widespread the permits are. They're everywhere. They're in. And I thought this was going to be true, which was that like Pennsylvania would have the most permits in the United States because we have the most stream miles next to Alaska. And for sure, that's what happened. We have the most permits because we have the most stream miles, and they're just discharging this shit everywhere. And in all these instances, they're not controlling radium. They're not saying you can only discharge 1 picocurie per liter of radium or 0. It should be 0 because radium's cumulative, right? So we're just building radium up. According to Duke University and the expert there, any discharge of radium from oil and gas waste into the waterways will accumulate as a potential threat to that waterway from radioactivity. Any discharge, if it's happening daily, every day. So it needs to be zero, and nobody's doing zero. So that's the best case scenario, right? That's the treatment centers who are doing, quote unquote, best technology from the fracking industry, using the distillation process and then cleaning it and putting it back into the river. Total farce being spread by the state, being spread by the federal government, by the industry worldwide. Not true. And the work that we've done also shows where else it goes. And it generally goes to landfills. Landfills take the liquid waste and they turn it into solid by mixing it with material or mixing it with mulch and then loading that into the landfill itself. So what happens then? Well, it rains and it turns into landfill leachate and it pulls up in ponds or in holding tanks. Where does that go? It goes to the publicly owned water treatment works, so usually sewage facilities. Well, guess what? Sewage facilities aren't equipped to handle radioactivity. They don't treat radioactivity like the other places who are also not equipped because they don't have the technology. So it's going to a sewage facility, doesn't have the technology, discharging radium back into the waterways, and not only discharging radium into the waterways, but in some cases discharging more radium because the place has become radioactive because it's been handling radium for so long. So now it's like a radioactive hotspot. So the amount of radium coming in might be 10,000 and the amount going out might be 12,000 because they're now creating hotter radioactive water that leaves the place. So this got so bad, and I'm going to share the link to the story, that it actually shut down certain sewage facilities because the leachate, this is what happened, which is that they just renamed fracking waste basically by taking it to a landfill, right? It rains, then all of a sudden it turns into leachate. So the leachate that goes to the sewage plant being renamed was so problematic and so toxic that it was killing the bugs that are supposed to treat the sewage. So therefore, the sewage plant wasn't functioning properly, and it was discharging more contaminants into the waterway. So there's a whole like snowball of problems associated with this. So we published the first stories on this back in 2019, and we made a map of where all this shit was happening and who was involved. And man, people were running for the hills. All of a sudden the state, didn't know which landfill held what. And, the treatment process was safe. Nobody should worry about it. And then 2 years later, the governor has to put out a mandate that says we have to test all leachate for radium. And we're going to start doing that right now. So now all of a sudden the governor in Pennsylvania is going to start testing radium in all the leachate coming out of landfills. And they're supposed to have that data, have not given us that data yet. And we're still going after it at this point. But that story that I shared is the beginning of this radioactivity is the beginning of exposing the radioactive discharge from fracking waste into American waterways. So if it's not going in Grant, it's not going underneath their town. This is the reality, which is it's going above ground and then getting back into our waterways because it's not being handled as a hazardous waste. It has to be contained and locked up and put in the same places that you put waste from nuclear technology, right? Like that's where it needs to be stored, and that's not where it's being stored. That's what's happening right now. Sorry, that story is so
Wow.
huge, and we've been following it like hardcore. So,
Oh my gosh. Well, that's daunting.
Do I have time for one last? Shall I ask my last question, and then maybe Bianca, you can always send a message to the waiting room if it goes slightly over 6 o'clock.
For sure.
So I was just wondering, and I haven't had time to, or like the bandwidth to fully articulate the question, but throughout this week, we've been hearing from people who maybe find that rights as a framework is not the best way of going about it, because they feel like it kind of maybe imposes a Western framework onto other countries. We've been hearing from people who maybe would prefer to try justice, understanding that more as like a living process or as a process itself and a constantly ongoing one. And then, of course, we've been hearing from people who are kind of speaking to the strength and the power of rights of nature. And I just was wondering, as a final thing, whether you could kind of speak a little bit about your experience. Obviously, you're a proponent of it, but why it kind of speaks to you as a method, a framework that can help us try and ensure, more healthier ecosystems and ones that get to fulfill their functions and this type of thing, whilst also protecting community rights.
Okay, yeah. So the brief answer from my perspective on that is that anything, I don't care what you want to call it, anything that puts nature at the center of decision making is the right approach. If you want to call it rights of nature, if you want to call it something else, in terms of cultural traditions, as long as that's the standard, right? And that's the way decisions are being made, and that they're following the laws of nature because they're choosing nature first rather than choosing man and humankind first. Then I think that that's the right answer, to be honest. The idea of rights in general, I mean, I don't know. I mean, we're dealing with we're dealing with the result of freedoms for the most part. Like, our freedoms allow us to exploit the environment in ways that are catastrophic and suicidal. So there's a much larger philosophical question about freedoms and rights and what the reality of that is and responsibilities. And I think that, some of the indigenous nations in the United States have some of the best answers about that when it comes to protecting those spaces and the responsibility that they have to protect those spaces. And I think that conversation, for me, I think is blossoming most and has some of the best examples within how they're protecting or what they want to do to protect the salmon in Northwest United States and in the western parts of Canada. Like the way that they're discussing that idea of inheritance and protecting the environment. I would definitely advise people to go check them out, see what they're saying, and just pay close attention to what's happening over there, because they have some really tremendous, thoughtful leaders on this movement who are incorporating, the indigenous language and wisdom to answering these problems. Philosophically, for me, like, I wish I could just sit back and, dream up metaphysical responses to this stuff all the time. And that would be so freaking awesome. And in that space, if I was doing that, then I would think that what's going to happen is that the rights of nature is going to introduce a new government, and it will be an evolution out of democracy. So democracy itself will evolve into new government because of rights of nature. I don't think realistically democracy can switch to becoming an ecocentric, nature first type of system. I think it's very much built upon putting humans first and built upon anthropocentric structures. I don't think it can get out of that. But I do think in that respect that it's not going to be like, democracy or communism, let's just say, right? It just means that this government will evolve into a new form of government, which is built upon the premise of laws of nature, of something like the rights of nature. And that's how decisions are made. And that's how the Constitution is constructed. And where can we see examples of that? Well, mostly in the places that we've exploited and tried to kill democracy for the last 100 years, which is South America. South America is rewriting their constitutions to include rights of nature, like they're doing in Chile right now, which just gave indigenous people supposedly some of the strongest powers out of any government down there. We'll see if that holds true. or in places like Ecuador and Bolivia, where they rewrote those constitutions to include rights of nature. Like, that's the future, you know, like that's where this idea of evolving government is going to go. And that is why it's just so hopeful. Like, you can think about all the dark shit that's happening, but those changes are freaking like revolutionary. Like, you imagine your constitution adopting rights, like the US Constitution adopting rights of nature as a statute, and like that's the future. Like, holy shit, like that would be amazing. So I think like that is super helpful, and I've just been calling it natocracy because I wanted to make a word for it. So my idea of the government in the future is called natocracy, whatever. And I've started to write a book about it and make a film about it, just to try and like express, you know, what I think that could look like. And I think that's because this is just a natural evolution as a response to capitalism, as a response to communism, as a response to thousands of years of anthropocentric Western ideas that are going to die and move into a new world of knowledge that's ecocentric based. So that's basically, yeah, where my thoughts are on that.
Thank you. And just overall, thanks for that response, but also for the rest of them. It's been a really thought-provoking and rich Q&A. So thank you.
Thanks for your questions. They're awesome.
For people who haven't watched the documentary yet, you can still do that for the rest of the day. And yeah, thank you for coming, and thank you, Joshua.